The sun was setting, painting the sky over San Diego Bay a wash of crimson and gold, like watercolors on a canvas. A gentle sea breeze rustled the palm trees that lined the neat street where the Stevens home stood. Evan Stevens, a captain in the U.S. Navy destroyer, strode down the sidewalk, carrying a small leather suitcase in one hand and a bouquet of white lilies in the other that he had bought at the airport, remembering how Rachel had loved them in the early years of their marriage. His uniform, pressed to perfection despite the long flight, fit him like a glove, highlighting the broad shoulders and poise of years of service. Tall and erect, he seemed to bear not only the weight of his luggage, but also the weight of his years. Evan's face was rough, with sharp cheekbones and a deep line between his brows, the result of long thought and difficult decisions. The stubble that was beginning to appear on his chin gave him the look of a man who was not used to wasting time on trifles. His eyes, gray-blue, usually hard as steel, now seemed tired. They showed not only the physical fatigue of the flight, but also an inner anxiety, quiet, stubborn, haunting. Evan was a man of duty. Strict with himself, silent by nature, he rarely shared his feelings, even with his loved ones. For his subordinates, he was a model of discipline and composure. For his friends, he was a reliable wall that could be leaned on in any storm. But behind this external fortress hid a man who was vulnerable and subtle, who simply learned to carefully hide his weaknesses. His love for his family was always expressed in actions, not in words. Letters, rare calls, gifts from ports, wherever he was. Today, returning home after a long voyage, he felt something unusual uncertainty. Everything around him was familiar, but something inside told him that time and distance could change a lot. He did not know if his home would greet him with the same warmth he remembered. And it was this uncertainty much more frightening than any military operation that was reflected in his gaze. The last few months at sea had been tough. The mission to Japan, which involved patrolling disputed territory in the South China Sea, had required his full concentration. He was used to discipline, to clear orders, to the rhythm of shipboard life, where everything was subject to a strict schedule. But at home, in this cozy two-story house with white walls and blue shutters, the rules were different. And Evan felt that with each return, those rules eluded him more and more. He paused at the gate, looking at the house. The light in the living room windows was soft, and shadows flickered through the curtains. Evan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the fatigue and collect his thoughts. He had not been home for 4 months. 4 months without calls, without letters, only the occasional text from Rachel, dry and formal. "Everything is fine. I hope you are too." Once she wrote him long letters full of warmth, describing her paintings, sharing her dreams of travel, of the house they would build somewhere by the sea. Now her words seemed cut out of a telegram. Something had changed, and Evan felt it even before he set foot on his native soil. He pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard. A couple of new ceramic pots with geraniums in bloom stood by the porch. Rachel must have decided to update the garden. It was like her. She always found solace in beauty, in the little things that made their home come alive. Evan smiled at the corner of his lips, but it quickly faded. He noticed a bicycle leaning against the wall of the garage. Not his, not Rachel's, someone else's, with a black frame and a worn seat. Something tightened in his chest, but he pushed it away. Just a neighbor's, I guess, he thought, although the first seed of doubt was already growing in his mind. The door opened as soon as he knocked. Rachel stood there, and for a moment Evan froze, as if he were seeing her for the first time, or as if he were seeing someone he had known for a long time, but suddenly no longer recognized. She was still the same. Long brown hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, slightly disheveled, as if she had just put down her brush or gotten up from her easel. Large green eyes, in which some elusive secret always hid, like the reflection of a distant forest in the water of a lake. A slender figure, wrapped in a light sea-green dress that gently swayed in the light evening breeze, as if the fabric had a life of its own. But there was something wrong with her gaze. A subtle change, almost invisible to an outsider, caught Evan's eye with painful clarity. She smiled, a familiar movement of her lips, as she had done dozens of times when he returned from the sea. but there was no warmth in that smile now. It seemed forced, like a mask put on out of politeness or the duty of a hostess opening the door to an unexpected guest. Her eyes did not light up, did not widen with joy, did not flutter her eyelashes as before when she rushed to meet him. Instead, in the depths of her pupils there was a reserve, a caution, as if she were looking at him as if he were a stranger, trying to decide whether he was still the one she had once awaited with bated breath. Evan felt something tighten inside him. He knew that look, the way you look at an old photograph. With love, yes, but also with a longing for a time that was gone and might never return. He wanted to say something, a simple phrase, warm and alive and real, but the words caught in his throat, and instead he simply handed her the lilies. White, fragile, pure, they seemed almost out of place in this strange, tense moment. Rachel took them silently, looking down, and only then did he notice. There was weariness in her movements. Not physical weariness, but weariness of the heart. Weariness of waiting, of silence, of unanswered questions. Still, she retreated into the house, leaving the door ajar. Evan stepped forward into the dimly lit hallway that smelled of mint and oil paints and realized this house was still theirs. But inside, much might be gone. "Evan," she said quietly, stepping back to let him through. "You're back." "Yes," he answered, trying to sound warm. "I'm home, Rachel." He stepped forward, leaning in to kiss her, but she turned her head slightly, and his lips only touched the corner of her mouth. The moment was fleeting, but Evan felt something inside him tighten even more. He straightened up, handing her the lilies. "This is for you," he said, watching her reaction. Rachel took the bouquet and inhaled the scent, but her eyes didn't light up like before. She nodded, murmuring, "Thank you. They are beautiful." She turned and walked into the living room, leaving him standing in the hallway. Evan set his suitcase by the door and followed her, feeling the silence between them become almost tangible. The living room was just as he remembered it. Rachel's paintings adorned the walls, bright landscapes full of light and emotion, a bookcase filled with art and poetry, a soft sofa with pillows she'd sewn herself. But something was off. There was a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses on the coffee table. One was empty. The other held the dregs of the ruby drink. "Were you expecting someone?" Evan asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, but there was still a hint of suspicion in it. Rachel turned around, her eyebrows rising slightly, but she quickly looked down. "Oh, it's... Thomas came by. He brought a bottle from his winery. We were just chatting." "Thomas," Evan frowned, trying to remember if she had mentioned that name before. "Yes, our new neighbor. He moved in a couple of months ago. Remember, I wrote that the house across the street was sold?" Evan nodded, although he didn't remember any letter about the neighbor. He didn't remember her writing anything at all, except those short messages. But he didn't argue. Instead, he took off his cap, laid it on the back of the chair, and asked, "And what were you chatting about?" Rachel shrugged as she placed the lilies in a vase on the windowsill. Her movements were fluid, but there was a hint of nervousness in them. "About different things. About wine, about paintings. He is interested in art. He even bought one of my works at the last exhibition." "Really?" Evan tried to sound interested, but there was still a hint of coldness in his voice. "A generous neighbor." Rachel looked at him, and for a second something flashed in her eyes, irritation. Hurt? But she quickly looked away. "Yes, he is. Nice. He helps when you are not there. He fixed my easel when it broke. He brought seedlings for the garden." Evan felt something hot boiling in his chest, but he pushed it down. He was a captain, used to holding himself in check, controlling his emotions like he controlled his ship in a storm. But here, in this cozy living room, he felt helpless. "I'm glad you have company," he said, and the words came out sharper than he intended. Rachel froze, her hand still on the vase. She turned slowly toward him, her gaze sharp, almost accusing. "Evan, don't start. I'm just..." She paused, searching for words. "I'm just trying to live while you're gone." "Live?" He stepped closer, his voice lower, but there was tension in it. "Rachel, I'm doing this for us. For our family. Do you think it's easy for me to be out there at sea for months? Do you think it's easy for me to be here alone?" Her voice broke, and she turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. "You leave, and I stay, over and over again. I'm not complaining, Evan, but I'm tired of being alone." Evan wanted to answer, but the words were stuck in his throat. He looked at her frail figure, at her hair tucked behind her ear, and he felt a wall growing between them. He wanted to touch her, to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear that she would push him away. Maybe it was the feeling that he was already too late. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud laugh coming from the garden. Evan turned to the window and saw a man standing by the fence. Tall, with dark hair, wearing a light linen shirt and jeans, he looked like he had stepped out of a magazine cover. He was holding a bottle of wine and was talking to someone in the yard. Evan immediately realized it was Thomas Brooks. "Is that him?" Evan asked, not taking his eyes off the window. Rachel nodded, her face calmer, almost relieved. "Yes. Do you want me to introduce you?" Evan didn't answer right away. He watched Thomas laugh, the way he tossed the bottle effortlessly from one hand to the other, the way his eyes glittered in the rays of the setting sun. Something about the man made Evan instinctively distrust him. Maybe it was his too open smile. Maybe it was the way he looked at the house, at a lot of houses. "Sure," Evan finally said, though there was no enthusiasm in his voice. "Why not?" Rachel walked out into the yard and Evan followed her, feeling his heart beat a little faster. Thomas noticed them and immediately walked towards them, his walk confident, almost casual. "Ray," he exclaimed, smiling broadly, "I brought the wine I was talking about. Merlot, last year's vintage, you'll like it." He stopped when he noticed Evan, and his smile became a little more reserved, but no less friendly. "And you must be Evan," he said, holding out his hand. "Thomas Brooks, your new neighbor. Nice to finally meet you. Rachel's told me a lot about you." Evan shook his hand, feeling Thomas's fingers squeeze his palm a little too tightly. He noticed Thomas calling his wife Ray, a name only those closest to her called her. It stung, but he kept his cool. "Likewise," Evan replied, looking at Thomas carefully. "Rachel mentioned that you're a winemaker." "Yeah," Thomas nodded, his eyes sparkling. "I have a small winery in Napa. Nothing grand, but I love what I do. And you're a real hero, they say. A ship's captain, huh?" "Serving my country," Evan answered shortly. He didn't like being called a hero. The word seemed empty to him, too heavy for what he did. Thomas smiled even wider, as if he hadn't noticed the coldness in Evan's tone. "Well, that's impressive. Ray, you didn't say your husband was so modest." Rachel laughed, and her laugh was light, almost carefree, something Evan hadn't heard in a long time. She looked at Thomas, and there was a warmth in her gaze that cut to Evan's heart. "He's always like this," she said, lightly touching Thomas's arm. "Evan, shall we go inside? I'll make dinner, and Thomas will tell you about his wine." "Oh, I won't stay," Thomas said, holding up his hands in surrender. "I don't want to interrupt your reunion. I just dropped by to drop off a bottle. But Evan, if you want to come by sometime, I've got a couple of great bottles worth trying." "Thanks," Evan replied, but his voice was flat, almost formal. "Maybe sometime." Thomas nodded, smiled at Rachel once more, and left with a wave. Evan watched him go, feeling something dark, almost primal, building in his chest. He wasn't a jealous person, at least, he had never been. But this man, this Thomas Brooks, with his easy smile and too friendly tone, gave him a feeling he couldn't quite explain. When they got back to the house, Rachel wasted no time in heading for the kitchen. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical, but there was a restrained grace to them, as if each gesture had been carefully calibrated so as not to betray her inner turmoil. She pulled a knife and a wooden board from a drawer and began chopping vegetables, carrots, onions, red peppers, and each sound of the blade cutting into the flesh seemed louder than usual in the quiet of their small kitchen. Evan, lowered into a chair at the dining room table, watched her, his fingers tapping nervously on the wood, betraying his unease. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask what had changed, why her eyes, which had once sparkled at the sight of him, now looked past her, into emptiness. But instead, as if given to some inner impulse, he said, "I'm sorry." "Does he come by often?" Rachel froze. Her hand holding the knife stopped mid-stroke, and for a moment it seemed as if she would stop breathing altogether. But then she continued cutting as if nothing had happened, and answered without looking up. "Sometimes." Her voice was even, almost indifferent, but Evan caught the slight tremor she was trying to hide. "He's a good man, Evan. Just a neighbor." "Just a neighbor," Evan repeated, his voice quieter than he'd expected. The word neighbor hung in the air like a heavy fog he couldn't breathe in or push away. He looked at her back, the way her shoulders had tensed slightly, and he felt a cold emptiness growing in his chest. "Yes," she said without turning around, and added, as if defending herself, "he helps sometimes. With firewood, with the car. You know, things like that." "Things like that," Evan echoed. He didn't know why every word she said felt like a blow, but he couldn't stop himself from wanting to dig deeper. "And you talk to him often." Rachel finally turned, her eyes meeting his, but there was no warmth or anger in them, only weariness, as if she had answered this question in her head 100 times already. "Evan," she began, her tone both soft and sharp, like she was trying to balance on a thin thread. "What do you want to hear? That I run to him for every little thing? Or that he's more to me than just the guy who lives 2 doors down? He's just there, you know. He's here when—" She trailed off, as if she'd said too much, and turned back to the cutting board. "Forget it." "When I'm not here," Evan finished for her, his voice shaking. He felt his heart tighten, as if someone were squeezing it in a fist. "Is that what you wanted to say?" Rachel didn't answer. She dropped the chopped vegetables into the pan, and the sizzle of oil filled the silence, which became almost unbearable. Evan looked at her slender fingers that had once been intertwined with his, at her face that he loved more than anything in the world. But now it wasn't just this old wooden table between them, where they had once laughed until they cried, sharing stories of their dreams. There was an ocean between them now, not the one he had crossed in his ship, sailing beneath the stars, but another one, the one that separated two hearts that had once beaten in unison. "Rachel," he began, his voice hoarse, like the words were catching in his throat. "I don't want this to be. I don't want to sit here and feel like you're in another world. Tell me what's going on, please." She paused, her hands on the tabletop, and for a second it seemed she was about to speak, to spill everything that had accumulated over the months of his absence. But instead, she just shook her head. "I don't know, Evan," she said quietly. "I don't know how to explain it. You leave, and I stay. I always stay. And every time you come back, I try to find the Evan I knew, but—" She paused, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe it's me who's changed. Maybe it's both of us." "Both of us?" he asked, and there was more pain in his voice than he wanted to let on. "I'm still here, Rachel. I'm still the same person who leaves," she interrupted, her words as sharp as the knife she'd just been using to chop vegetables. "You always leave, Evan, and I don't blame you for that, really. It's your life, your passion. But I can't always be the one waiting." Evan opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at her face, lit by the dim light of the kitchen lamp, and saw in her eyes not just weariness, but something else, a determination he hadn't seen before. That was what scared him most of all. They ate in silence, and each bite tasted bland to Evan, as if the food had lost all meaning. He looked at her hands, at her profile, at the way she carefully lifted her fork to her lips, and he felt something inside him crumble. He knew he had to do something to get her back, to swim across this damn ocean that separated them. But he didn't know where to start, and deep down, where his darkest fears hid, he was afraid that maybe it was too late. "I can stay," he said suddenly, and his voice sounded unexpectedly firm. "This time, I cannot leave." Rachel looked at him, and something like surprise flashed in her eyes, but it immediately disappeared. "Don't say that," she said. her voice softer than before, but still distant. "You can't leave the sea, Evan. It's a part of you. And I don't want to be the one to take away what you love." "What if I love you more?" he asked, his words hanging in the air, heavy and sincere. Rachel smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of unspoken words. She put down her fork and looked at him as if she were trying to memorize his face. "If that were true," she said quietly, "we would not be sitting here, separated by this table." Evan felt his throat tighten. He wanted to stand up, go to her, hug her like before, but something in her eyes held him there. He knew that this conversation was just the beginning, that there would be more words, more pain, and maybe more hope ahead. But for now, all he could do was sit and look at her, trying to find in her eyes some spark of what had once connected them. Mornings began quietly in the Stevens house, as if time itself had slowed down so as not to disturb the fragile silence that had settled between Evan and Rachel. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor of the living room. Evan sat at the kitchen table, holding a mug of black coffee that had grown cold. He had been awake most of the night, lying next to Rachel, but feeling infinitely far away. Her breathing was even calm, but even in sleep she did not turn toward him, did not press against him as she used to. This lack of closeness, this silent distance between their bodies on the wide bed, cut him more sharply than any storm he had encountered at sea. Evan Stevens, a captain accustomed to clear orders and strict discipline, found himself helpless in the face of this new reality. He had always known how to handle a destroyer with a crew of 200, how to steer a ship through a storm, how to make decisions on which lives depended. But here, in his own home, he could not figure out how to get back what seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Rachel had changed, and it was not just the absence of letters or calls. It was in her eyes, which no longer sought his gaze, in her voice, which had become quieter, more distant, in her hands, which no longer reached out to him. Once, she wrote him long letters, filled with warmth and dreams. Each letter was like a small painting painted with words. She described sunsets over the bay, her new sketches, funny stories from her art studio. She sent them to the base, and Evan, sitting in his cabin, reread each word, feeling that home was still close. But in the last 2 years, the letters became rare and then disappeared altogether. The video calls that used to be their salvation turned into short, formal conversations. "How are you?" "Everything is fine." And silence. He thought it was temporary, that she was simply tired of waiting for him to return. But now that he was back, he saw that it was not just fatigue. Rachel spent way too much time with Thomas Brooks. Evan noticed it in the little things, the way she smiled when she mentioned his name, the way her voice came alive when she talked about his winery or how he helped her with her garden. Thomas was everywhere in her stories, in her laughter, in her eyes, and it bothered Evan. He wasn't the type to be suspicious, but every time he saw Thomas show up at their house with another bottle of wine or an offer to just chat, something inside him tensed like a rope about to break. Evan woke up early that morning before dawn. He couldn't lie in bed any longer, listening to the silence that screamed louder than any words. He went downstairs, made coffee, and sat by the window, looking out at the street. The house across the street, where Thomas lived, looked serene. A neatly trimmed lawn, a white picket fence, a few flower beds that Rachel had mentioned Thomas had helped her plant. Evan gripped his mug tighter than necessary and took a sip of cold coffee, trying to clear away the thoughts that were creeping into his head. He heard Rachel's footsteps on the stairs. She came into the kitchen, tying her hair into a messy bun. She was wearing a long t-shirt, one of the ones she wore when she worked on her paintings. Her face was pale, with faint shadows under her eyes, but she was still beautiful, the fragile, almost ethereal beauty that had once made him fall in love. "Good morning," she said without looking at him, and headed for the coffee maker. "Good morning," Evan said, watching her. He wanted to say something else, to ask how she slept or offer to make breakfast, but the words stuck. Instead, he asked, "Did you stay up late last night?" Rachel froze for a second, her hand shaking as she poured the coffee. "Yes," she answered without turning around. "I was working on a painting. I couldn't stop. Evan nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. He noticed that her easel in the living room had been empty for the last few days. If she was working on anything, it wasn't there. But he didn't argue. He just watched her move around the kitchen as if avoiding his gaze, and he felt the wall between them grow again. I was thinking maybe we could go to the bay today, he said, trying to keep his voice light. Like we used to. Remember when we'd get coffee and sit on the pier? Rachel finally looked at him, but her gaze was distracted, as if she was thinking about something else. Maybe, she said, I have a lot to do today. I need to finish the sketches for the gallery. Evan wanted to ask what sketches, but at that moment his gaze fell on the window overlooking the backyard. He noticed movement at the gate. Someone was leaving their house. A male figure, tall, in a dark jacket, with something light in his hands. Evan stood up, his heart beating faster. He went to the window, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. It was Thomas Brooks. He was walking down the path that led to the street, holding Rachel's coat in his hand, the cream-colored, long-belted one she wore to her shows. Evan froze, his breathing heavy. Thomas wasn't supposed to be here. Rachel had said he was in San Francisco for a few days on business with his winery. But here he was, walking out of their house in the early morning, holding her coat like it was the most normal thing in the world. Evan turned to Rachel, who was still standing by the coffee maker, her back to him. Her shoulders were tense, as if she could feel his gaze. Rachel, he said, his voice low, almost menacing. What was Thomas doing here? She turned around, her eyes widening, but she quickly pulled herself together. He came by last night, she said, trying to speak calmly. He brought wine samples for tasting. I asked him to help me choose some for the exhibition. Last night, Evan stepped closer, his brow furrowing. And he stayed until morning. Rachel pressed her lips together, her gaze darting to the window and then back to him. No, Evan, don't start, she said, and there was irritation in her voice. He left late, and this morning he came to get his. I gave him his coat because he left it here. His coat? Evan pointed to the window, where Thomas had already disappeared around the corner. That was your coat, Rachel. I saw it. She fell silent, her face growing even paler. She opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it, as if she had changed her mind. Evan looked at her, and in that moment he knew that no words or explanations were needed. He saw the truth in her silence, in her downcast eyes, in the way she clutched her mug as if it could keep her from falling into the abyss. Rachel, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. What's going on? She shook her head, her eyes shining, but there were no tears. Nothing's happening, Evan, she replied, her voice shaking. You're seeing things that aren't there. Then why won't you look me in the eye? He asked, his words hanging in the air, heavy as lead. Rachel set the mug down on the table, her movements sharp, almost angry. Because I'm tired, Evan, she cried, her voice echoing around the kitchen. I'm tired of your suspicions, of your silence, of you coming back and expecting everything to be like before. I can't do this anymore. Evan looked at her, his heart clenching. He wanted to answer, wanted to tell her that he was tired too, that he was fighting for them, that he loved her no matter what. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there alone. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. Not now. He stepped out into the yard, took a breath of the cool morning air, and looked at the house across the street. Thomas was there, on the other side of the fence, and Evan suddenly wanted to go there, knock on the door, and ask what this man was doing in his life. But he held back. He was a captain, a man who knew how to keep his temper in check. But in that moment, he felt like he was losing control not of the ship, not of the crew, but of what mattered most to him. His family. Evan Stevens drove along the highway leading to the north side of San Diego, where Rachel's longtime friend Kelly Wilson lived. The road wound along the coast, and the ocean to his left shimmered in the morning sun, as if mocking his confusion. His hands gripped the steering wheel of the old pickup truck he rarely used, preferring to hike or drive for work. Today, the car was his sanctuary, the only place he could escape the chaos raging in his head. The radio was silent, and the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional squeal of tires on asphalt. Evan didn't turn on music. He didn't want anything to distract him from the thoughts that rolled over each other like storm waves. The morning at the Stevens house had left a deep rift in his soul. The moment he saw Thomas Brooks walk out of their house with Rachel's coat in his hands had been a punch to the gut. He hadn't screamed, he hadn't gone after Thomas, he hadn't made a scene with Rachel. Instead, he had walked away, silent, with the cold determination that had always served him at sea, but now seemed useless. He didn't know what to do with this feeling, a mixture of anger, pain, and a strange, almost paralyzing helplessness. Evan Stevens, a captain accustomed to commanding and in control, felt his life crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. Kelly was the only person he could turn to. She knew Rachel better than anyone. They had been friends since college, going to art shows together, sharing dreams and frustrations. Kelly was straightforward, sometimes to the point of rudeness, and Evan hoped she wouldn't balk if he asked her directly. He didn't want speculation or rumors. He wanted the truth, no matter how painful it was. Kelly's house was in a quiet La Jolla neighborhood, surrounded by neat cottages with blooming gardens and ocean views. Evan parked in front of her house, turned off the engine, and sat for a few seconds, staring at the white gate that led to the porch. His heart was beating steadily, but his chest felt heavy, as if someone had placed a stone there. He took a deep breath, got out of the car, and headed for the door. His steps were as steady as on the deck of a ship, but inside he felt like he was walking on thin ice. Kelly opened the door almost immediately after he knocked. She was wearing jeans and a loose t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she was holding a mug of tea. Her face, usually open and welcoming, tightened when she saw Evan. She knew he wasn't the type to just come in and chat. "Evan," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't expect to see you. Is everything okay?" He walked in without answering right away. Kelly's living room was bright, with large windows overlooking the garden and lots of potted plants. There was an open book on the sofa and a bowl of unripe mango on the table. Everything here was so alive, so normal. Evan felt a twinge of envy at the simplicity, at a life that hadn't been torn apart by long service and silent breakups. "I need to talk," he said finally, sitting down on the couch. His voice was low, but there was a pent-up storm in it. "About Rachel." Kelly set her mug down on the table and sat down across from him, crossing her arms. Her brown eyes studied him, and Evan saw something in them, concern mixed with sympathy. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. She simply waited, and the silence only strengthened his resolve. "I saw Thomas Brooks," he began, looking her straight in the eye. "This morning, he was leaving our house, with her coat in his hands. She said he came by last night, but I know he was supposed to be in San Francisco. I want the truth, Kelly. No prevarication." Kelly looked away, her fingers curling slightly, as if she were trying to hold something inside. She was silent, and that silence was louder than any words. Evan felt his heart tighten, as if someone was slowly squeezing it in a fist. He leaned forward, his voice quieter, but there was steel in it. "Tell me, does she sleep with him?" Kelly looked at him, and her eyes were like a mirror, reflecting the truth he was afraid to see. She didn't answer right away, but her gaze, full of pain, regret, and some strange sense of guilt, said everything. Evan felt the air leave his lungs. He leaned back against the couch, his hands falling limply into his lap. He waited for her to say something, to disprove his suspicions, to tell him he had gotten it all wrong. But Kelly was silent, and her silence was like a sentence. "Kelly," he said, his voice breaking despite his best efforts. "I have to know, please." She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she had been carrying a heavy burden and had finally decided to throw it off. "Evan, I don't know everything," she began, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "But I know Rachel, she's messed up. She doesn't say it outright, but I can see how she's changed. She spends a lot of time with Thomas. He gives her what she's missing." The attention, the laughter, the feeling that she's alive. Evan gritted his teeth, his fingers curling into fists. He didn't want to hear it, but at the same time he couldn't stop her. He needed the truth, even if it was tearing him apart. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "She's with him. She loves him." Kelly shook her head, her eyes shining, but she kept her composure. "I don't know if she loves him," she said, "but I know she's unhappy. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. You've been gone so long, Evan. Months, sometimes half a year. She's alone, and it's breaking her. Thomas, he just happened to be there. He listens to her, he makes her laugh. He sees her as an artist, a woman, as well as a captain's wife." Evan closed his eyes, trying to fight off the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He saw Rachel before him, her smile, her eyes, her hands covered in paint as she worked on her paintings. He loved her so much that sometimes it scared him. But he didn't know how to show it, how to cross the ocean that separated them. He was a soldier, a sailor, a man who always put his duty first. But now he realized that maybe that duty had cost him too much. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "Why didn't she just talk to me?" Kelly looked at him with sympathy, but there was also a shadow of reproach in her gaze. "Did you give her a chance?" she asked. "You come back, Evan, but you're not here. You think about the ship, about the missions, about duty. You don't ask her how she feels, what she wants. You just expect her to be the same Rachel who saw you off 10 years ago. But she's changed. And so have you." Her words were like a blow. Evan wanted to protest, to say that he had tried, that he had done all this for them, for their future. But he knew Kelly was right. He had seen Rachel drift away, but instead of fighting for her, he had retreated into his armor, into his usual role as captain, where everything was under control. Only now did he realize that this control had been an illusion. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, and the admission was hard. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, to asking for help. But now he felt lost, as if his ship had been blown off course on the high seas. Kelly leaned forward, her voice softening. "Talk to her, Evan. Don't blame, don't demand. Just talk. She still loves you, I know. But she's confused, and she needs you there. Not as her captain, but as her husband." Evan nodded, but his chest was still aching. He stood up, thanked Kelly for her honesty, and walked out of her house, feeling like the world was crumbling around him. He got into his car, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he just sat there, looking out at the ocean in the distance, trying to figure out how he'd ended up here, a man who could steer a ship through a storm, but couldn't save his own marriage. When he got home, Rachel was in her studio. The door was ajar, and he saw her standing at her easel, her brush frozen in midair, as if she couldn't find inspiration. He wanted to come in, wanted to tell her everything that was pent up in his soul, but instead he just looked at her fragile figure, at her hair falling on her shoulders. He loved her, and he was afraid that he had already lost her. Evan turned and walked into the living room, where Thomas's bottle of wine still sat on the table. He picked it up, feeling the cool glass beneath his fingers, and for a moment he wanted to smash it against the wall. But he held back. He was a captain. He knew how to control himself. But at that moment, he realized that it might not be enough. Evan Stevens watched the gray waves rolling onto the Oregon coast, feeling the cold wind off the Pacific Ocean creep under his jacket. Cannon Beach was nearly empty on this early October day, just a few locals strolling in the distance and seagulls squawking as they circled the water. Haystack Rock loomed over the horizon, massive and unyielding, as if to remind Evan of how small he was in the face of time and nature. He stood on the sand, hands in his pockets, trying to remember what it felt like to be happy, trying to remember what it felt like to be home. 2 weeks ago, he did something he hadn't done in his entire career. He took a vacation. Not because he was tired of the job, the sea was his element, his refuge, his place to breathe. He took a vacation because he couldn't stay in the house any longer, where every corner, every object reminded him of what he was losing. The conversation with Kelly, her silence, her eyes full of unspoken truth, had been the last straw. He couldn't look at Rachel without seeing the shadow of Thomas Brooks in her eyes. He couldn't sleep in the bed they shared, knowing that she might no longer be his. And instead of making a scene, instead of demanding answers, he did what he did best. He retreated to gather his strength. Oregon had been his idea. When he told Rachel he was leaving, she had nodded, her face as blank as a canvas on which a painting had not yet been started. "Okay," she said quietly, and the word cut him more sharply than any reproach. She didn't ask where he was going, didn't offer to go with him. She simply turned and walked back to her studio, leaving him alone in the living room where Thomas's bottle of wine still sat. Evan didn't say goodbye. He packed a small backpack, got into his truck, and drove north to a place where everything had once been simple, to a place where he and Rachel had been happy. Cannon Beach had been their refuge 15 years ago, when they had come here as newlyweds on their honeymoon. They had been different then. He, a young lieutenant, full of ambition and faith that his service would change the world. She, an artist whose eyes shone when she looked at him, whose hands always found him, even in a crowd. They had rented a small cottage by the ocean, with battered wooden walls and a creaky bed that they thought was the coziest thing in the world. They had walked the beach, barefoot despite the cold, collecting shells, laughing as the seagulls stole their food. Rachel had told him then, "You are my anchor, Evan. Wherever you are, I will always come back to you." He had kept those words in his heart all these years, like a talisman, a reminder of what he was fighting for when he went out to sea. Now, standing on that same beach, Evan felt like the anchor she'd spoken of was no longer holding. He looked at the waves, their endless rhythm, and thought about how everything had changed. They'd been inseparable then, their love like a fire that never went out even in the rain. They'd spent their nights talking about the future, the children they wanted, the house they'd build somewhere by the water. Rachel would draw sketches in the sand, and he'd laugh as the waves washed away her sketches. They'd promised each other they'd never let anything come between them. But the years of service, the endless deployments, the silent nights, and her loneliness had taken their toll. The promises they'd made on that beach had faded like those sand drawings. Evan walked slowly along the shore, his boots leaving deep tracks in the wet sand. He stopped at the high tide line, where the water licked his shoes, and closed his eyes, trying to remember her laughter. He saw it so clearly. Rachel running along the beach, her hair blowing in the wind, her bare feet leaving tracks that were washed away by the waves. She would turn and laugh and shout, "Evan, catch me." And he would run, not because he wanted to catch her, but because her joy was infectious, because in those moments he felt alive. But now those memories were like old photographs, faded and fragile. He tried to hold on to them, but they slipped away like sand through his fingers. Evan crouched down, picked up a smooth pebble, and clutched it in his hand, as if it could hold on to the past. He thought about how it had all begun to fall apart. The first years of their marriage had been full of hope, despite his long absences. Rachel had written him letters, long, warm ones, telling him about her paintings, about exhibitions, about how much she missed him. He kept each letter in a metal box in his cabin, rereading them on difficult nights when the sea seemed endless. But then the letters became shorter, less frequent. Video calls that used to last for hours turned into 5-minute conversations, full of awkward silences. And in the last 2 years, she had almost stopped writing. He thought it was temporary, that she was just tired. But now, after talking to Kelly, after seeing Thomas leaving their house, he realized that fatigue had nothing to do with it. Evan stood up and walked toward the cottage he'd rented for the past 2 weeks. It wasn't the same house where they'd spent their honeymoon that had long since been rented out, but it was similar. Wooden walls painted gray, a small porch overlooking the ocean, the smell of salt and pine. Inside, everything was simple. An old couch covered with a blanket, a fireplace he hadn't lit yet, and a bed where he slept alone. He dropped his backpack in the corner and sat by the window, looking out at the water. The same question kept running through his head. How could he not notice that he was losing her? He remembered their last night before he left for Japan. They were sitting in the living room, and Rachel was unusually quiet. He asked if everything was all right, but she just nodded, looking into her glass of wine. He hadn't paid attention to it at the time. He had been too busy preparing for the mission, thinking about the ship, about the route. But now he saw that it had been a moment when she had tried to say something. Maybe she wanted to tell him about her loneliness, about how hard it was for her. Maybe she wanted to ask him to stay. But he didn't hear. He left, as always, confident that she would wait for him, as she had waited for all these years. Evan pulled out a small photograph from his backpack, the one he always took with him to sea. It was a picture from their wedding. Rachel in a simple white dress, flowers in her hair, and he in his dress uniform, smiling what had seemed like forever. He ran his finger over her face in the picture, feeling a lump in his throat. "You're my anchor," she'd said. But now he felt like the anchor had snapped, and he was adrift at sea with no direction. The days in Oregon dragged on. Evan spent his time walking on the beach, reading the books he'd brought with him, but he couldn't concentrate. He tried to text Rachel, but every time he opened his phone, his fingers hovered over the screen. What could he say? "I know you're with him. Why did you betray me?" Or maybe, "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." He didn't know how to start this conversation, and he was afraid that once he started, he wouldn't be able to stop. One evening, sitting by the fire, he decided to call her. He dialed the number, but after a few rings, he got an answering machine. Her voice, soft and warm, said, "This is Rachel. Leave a message. I'll call you back." Evan closed his eyes, listening to this voice that had once been home to him. He didn't leave a message. He just sat there, looking at the fire, and felt something die inside him. The next day, he went to the small local bar where he and Rachel had once drank hot chocolate out of the rain. The bar was almost the same. The same wooden tables, the same worn chairs, the same smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries. Evan ordered a whiskey and sat by the window, watching the rain pound the glass. He thought about how he and Rachel had laughed here, how she had drawn a picture of him on a napkin, how he had stolen a piece of pie from her, and she had pretended to be offended. The memories were so vivid, so real, he could almost feel her next to him. But then he remembered Thomas, his smile, his ease, his presence in their home, and reality returned, cold and merciless. Evan knew that inside himself he had already lost Rachel. Not because she was with Thomas, though that thought burned him like hot metal. He had lost her because he had failed to be what she needed. He had been her anchor, but an anchor that lasts too long becomes a chain. He had given her stability, but not warmth. He had given her a home, but not himself. By the end of the second week, Evan had made a decision. He didn't know if he could forgive her, if he could get back what they had. But he knew he couldn't just walk away. He was a captain, a man who never gave up, even when all seemed lost. He would go back to San Diego. He would talk to her. Not to blame, not to demand, but to find out if there was still a chance. And if not, he wanted to hear it from her. Evan gathered his things, left the keys to the cabin on the table, and climbed into the truck. The drive home was long, but he took his time. He looked at the ocean that stretched along the highway and thought that maybe the sea was the only thing that had never betrayed him. But even the sea couldn't give him what he was looking for. He wanted Rachel. He wanted their love. And he was willing to fight for it, even if it meant facing the truth he was afraid to hear. Evan Stevens drove back to San Diego, and every mile that separated him from home seemed at once too short and infinitely long. The drive from Oregon had been exhausting, not so much physically as emotionally. The scenery outside the window had changed from rugged cliffs and pine forests to the soft hills of California, but his thoughts remained constant, swirling around the same thing. Rachel, Thomas, their marriage, which now seemed like a ship that had long since lost its course. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't try to distract himself. The silence in the cab of the old pickup was his only companion, allowing him to sort through memories, words, moments he had missed. He felt like a captain standing on the bridge of a sinking ship, unsure whether to try to save it or abandon ship. A week in Oregon had given him time to think, but it hadn't given him answers. He'd wandered the beaches, sat by the fire, read through old notebook entries, trying to find some glimmer of hope. But instead of hope, He'd found only pain, the pain of knowing that he'd lost Rachel not when Thomas had come into their lives, but long before, when his service, his duty, his silence had begun to build an invisible wall between them. He remembered her laughter, her letters, her touches that had once been so natural, so necessary. Now they all seemed as distant as the stars he'd seen from the deck of his destroyer at sea. He arrived back in San Diego early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise above the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. The city was waking up slowly. Morning joggers were already streaming along the boardwalk. Coffee shops were opening their doors, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and freshly brewed coffee. Evan parked his truck outside the house, but he didn't get out right away. He sat and looked at their house, the white walls, the blue shutters, the geraniums blooming on the porch. Everything looked the same as it always did, but now he knew it was just a shell, a facade that hid another life, a life in which he might no longer be the main character. He picked up his suitcase and walked slowly to the porch. The gate creaked as if welcoming him, but there was no warmth in the sound. He noticed that Thomas's bike was no longer parked outside the garage, and it gave him a fleeting sense of relief that quickly turned to bitterness. The bike's absence didn't change anything. Thomas was already here, in their home, in their lives, and Evan knew he couldn't just erase his presence like footprints in the sand. As he approached the porch, he saw Rachel. She was sitting in a wicker chair, holding a glass of red wine despite the early hour. Her hair was loose, slightly tousled by the wind, and she was wearing the light cardigan she wore when she worked in her studio. She was looking out at the street, but her gaze was distant, as if she was seeing something that wasn't there. Evan stopped, feeling his heart squeeze. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, and yet so distant. He realized that she had been waiting for him, not because she wanted him to come back, but because she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Evan," she said quietly as he stepped onto the porch. Her voice was soft, but there was no joy in it. She didn't get up or go to him, she just looked at him, and her green eyes were tired. "Rachel," he said, setting his suitcase down by the door. He wanted to say something else, but the words were stuck in his throat. He just looked at her, trying to find in her face the girl who had once run barefoot along the beach in Oregon, calling him her anchor. She set her glass down on the small table next to her chair and crossed her arms defensively. The silence between them was heavy, almost tangible, like the air before a storm. Evan felt like he should start, like he should say something, but his thoughts were in disarray. He had spent a week preparing for this moment, but now, standing before her, he didn't know where to begin. Finally, he stepped forward and said, his voice low but firm, "I know everything." Rachel flinched, her fingers tightening on the sleeves of her sweater. She looked at him, and there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, but there were no tears, no panic. She was silent, and that silence was louder than any words. Evan waited for her to deny it, to make excuses, but she just sat there, looking at him, as if deciding whether to tell the truth or continue to hide behind omissions. "I talked to Kelly," he continued, his voice a little sharper. She didn't say it outright, but her eyes, they said it all. "And I saw him, Rachel. Thomas. This morning, hold your coat. You said he was in San Francisco, but he was here, in our house." Rachel looked down, her lips trembling, but she did not cry. She took a slow breath, as if gathering her strength, and finally spoke, her voice quiet but determined. "Then you must understand. You were gone a long time ago, Evan. Not physically, not from the ship, but from me. You come back, but you are not here. You are on your missions, on your orders, on your duty. And I am alone. All these years, while you were at sea, I waited. I wrote to you, I drew for you, I held on to us. But you stopped noticing me. You stopped seeing me." Her words were like a blow, but Evan didn't look away. He stood there, looking at her, and felt his heart break. He wanted to argue, to say that it was all for them, for their future, but he knew she was right. He had seen her change, her letters grow shorter, her smile fade, but he had done nothing. He had thought that his love, his sacrifices, would be enough. But they weren't. "And Thomas?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost alien. Did he notice you? Did he give you what I couldn't? Rachel looked up, and there was a mixture of pain and defiance in her eyes. She didn't deny it, she didn't lie. Instead, she said, Thomas listens to me. He's alive. He's here, Evan. He sees my paintings, he laughs at my jokes, he doesn't go away for months and leaves me alone. I didn't want this to happen, but I couldn't be alone anymore. Evan felt his hands curl into fists, but he didn't move. He looked at her, at the face he loved more than anything in the world, and he knew she was telling the truth. Not all of it, but enough that he felt the ground shift beneath him. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask how she could, how dare she ruin everything they had. But instead he said, his voice quiet but steely, I understood only one thing, Ray. You didn't betray me once. You betrayed me every day, when you laughed with him, when you shared with him what was supposed to be ours. You lay with me, but you didn't look me in the eye. You chose him, even if you didn't say it out loud. Rachel hung her head, her hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. She was silent, and that silence was like a knife, stabbing deeper. Evan waited for her to protest, for her to say that she loved him, that this could still be fixed. But she was silent, and that silence was her answer. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. His chest tightened, but he didn't let himself break. He was a captain, a man who could hold his own even when the world was falling apart. He turned, picked up his suitcase, and headed for the door. Rachel looked up, her voice breaking as she called after him. Evan, wait. We can talk. We can. No, Rachel, he cut her off without turning around. You made your choice. I can't force you to love me, and I can't live with that. He opened the door and walked out without looking back. His steps were firm, but inside he felt something crumbling, not just their marriage, but himself. He got into the truck, started the engine, and drove away, not knowing where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stay. Not now. Not after this. Rachel remained on the porch, her hands still clutching the sleeves of her sweater, her glass of wine untouched. She watched his car disappear around the corner and felt her heart break. She didn't cry. She just sat there, staring into space, realizing that she might have just lost everything. Evan drove without stopping until he reached the waterfront. He parked, got out, and walked toward the water, feeling the salty wind hit his face. He looked out at the ocean, at the endless waves that had always been his home, his refuge. But now even the ocean couldn't give him answers. He had lost her, and maybe he had lost himself. Morning came quietly in the Stevens house, as if the world around them held its breath, afraid to break the fragile silence that enveloped their home. The sun filtered through the thin curtains of the bedroom, casting golden streaks on the floor that trembled like reflections on water. Rachel opened her eyes slowly, almost reluctantly, feeling the heaviness in her chest that had not left her since Evan had left yesterday. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, where the old fan lazily turned its blades, creating a barely audible hum. The bed next to her was empty, the sheets cold, and the absence of warmth, the absence of his breath, his presence, cut her like a knife. She knew he was gone, but she still hoped that it was temporary, that he would return, as he always did, from his missions. But something in her heart told her that this time was different. Rachel turned her head and froze. On Evan's pillow lay a folded piece of paper, tucked neatly into a white envelope. Her heart sank, and for a moment she felt the air leave her lungs. She knew it was a letter, and she knew it was from him. His handwriting, as firm and clear as if carved in stone, was visible even through the envelope. She reached out, but her fingers shook, and she pulled them back as if afraid she would burn herself. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to read it. Because deep down, she already knew what it said, and that truth scared her more than anything she had ever known. She sat up in bed, drawing her knees up to her chest, and stared at the envelope on her pillow for a long moment. It was so plain, so ordinary, a white sheet of paper folded in half, without decoration, without unnecessary details. But in that envelope, she knew, was her destiny. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the last time Evan had written to her. It had been years ago, in the early years of their marriage, when he had been a young officer and she an artist full of dreams. His letters then had been full of warmth, promises, stories of the sea and the stars he had seen from the deck. She had kept them in a wooden box, rereading them on those nights when the loneliness had become unbearable. But this letter was different. She could feel it. Finally, gathering her strength, Rachel took the envelope and opened it. It was covered in his firm, neat handwriting, and each word seemed to cut into her heart like shards of glass. Rachel, you said I was your anchor, but you cut the rope yourself. I'm leaving not because I hate you, but because love is a choice. You made yours. Now it's my turn. E. Short, cruel in its simplicity. Each word was a blow, a wave crashing onto the shore and taking with it everything she had tried to hold on to. Rachel read the letter again, her eyes sliding over the lines again and again, as if she could find something else in them, some hope, some forgiveness. But there was nothing there but the truth, the cold, unforgiving truth of her own making. She clutched the paper in her hand, feeling the paper crumple beneath her fingers. Her chest tightened, her breath came in short gasps, and for the first time in a long time, she felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't cried yesterday when Evan left. She hadn't cried when he'd accused her. She hadn't cried when she'd stayed silent and let him go. But now, holding this letter, she felt her world crumble. She hadn't just lost Evan, she'd lost everything they'd built, everything that had been their life. Rachel got out of bed, her legs shaking as if the ground beneath her was unstable. She went to the window, pulled back the curtains, and looked out. The house across the street, where Thomas lived, was silent, its windows closed, and for a moment she felt hatred not for him, but for herself. She knew that it was she who had ruined their marriage, not Thomas. He was just part of her weakness, her escape from the loneliness she could no longer bear. She remembered how it had all begun, the innocent conversations, his smile, his attention that was so easy, so natural. He had listened to her, he had seen her, he had made her feel alive. But now, looking at that letter, she knew it had been an illusion. She had not found happiness in Thomas, she had simply hidden from pain. She walked back to the bed and sat up, still clutching the letter in her hand. The memories came flooding back like waves, one after another, and she couldn't stop them. She remembered their wedding, a small ceremony at the base in San Diego, where she stood in a white dress, holding his hand, and felt like the world belonged to them. She remembered their honeymoon in Oregon, lying on the beach, looking at the stars, promising each other to be together no matter what. She remembered writing him letters, pouring her heart and her dreams into them. But as the years went by, his missions grew longer, and her loneliness grew deeper. She tried to be strong, tried to be the wife who waited, who supported him. But at some point, she broke, and Thomas was there to catch her. Rachel stood up and walked to her studio, where her easel had been empty for weeks. She hadn't painted since Evan's return, and she couldn't find inspiration. Her paintings, once full of light and life, now seemed foreign to her. She walked over to one of them, a landscape of a sunset over the sea that she had painted for Evan in the early years of their marriage. She ran her fingers over the canvas, feeling the texture of the paint, and her eyes filled with tears again. She remembered the way he'd looked at that painting, the way his eyes would light up, the way he'd say it was the best thing he'd ever seen. She'd felt then that her art had meaning because it was for him. Now she felt empty. She sank to the floor, clutching the letter to her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. The tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and uncontrollable, and she made no attempt to stop them. She cried not just for the loss of Evan, but for herself, for the Rachel who had once been full of life, full of love, full of hope. She had lost her somewhere along the way, in the endless months of waiting, in the silence that filled their home. She remembered their last conversation, his words cutting her like a knife. "You betrayed me every day." He was right. She knew it. Every time she laughed with Thomas, every time she let him get closer than she should have, she cut another thread that connected her to Evan. She hadn't wanted it, hadn't planned it, but it had happened, and now she faced the consequences of her choice. Rachel stood up, wiped her tears, and walked over to the table where her letterbox lay. She opened it, taking out Evan's old letters that she had kept all these years. She reread them, feeling how each word took her back to the days when their love was strongest. But now the letters felt foreign to her, as if they were written by someone else for someone else. She placed his last letter on top, closed the box, and felt something inside her finally break. She walked out onto the porch where she had been sitting when Evan returned yesterday. The glass of wine was still on the table, untouched, a reminder that she had tried to numb her pain. She picked it up but did not drink it. Instead, she poured it onto the ground, watching the red liquid soak into the grass. It was her small act of release, her attempt to let go of what she could no longer hold on to. Rachel knew she had to do something, call Evan, find him, try to explain. But she also knew he was right. Love was a choice, and she hadn't chosen him. Not because she didn't love him, but because she was tired of being alone. Now she had to live with that choice, with that emptiness, with that pain. She walked back into the house, sat down at the table, and picked up a blank sheet of paper. She wanted to write to him, to tell him that she was sorry, that she still loved him, that she was willing to fight. But her hand froze over the paper, and she realized that she didn't know what to say. She was no longer the Rachel who wrote him long letters full of love. She was different, broken, lost, and she didn't know if she would ever find herself again. Rachel sat there until evening, staring at the blank page, until the sun sank below the horizon, turning the sky crimson. She felt her world crumbling, and she didn't know how to put it back together. Evan was gone, and a part of her soul was gone with him. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had cut the rope, and now she had to learn to live without her anchor. It had been 8 months since Evan Stevens had left San Diego, his home, his wife, and his old life behind. 8 months had been enough for the world around him to change, but inside he still felt empty, as if part of his soul had been left behind on that porch where he had last spoken to Rachel. He hadn't returned, hadn't called, hadn't written. His letter, left on her pillow, was the last word he'd ever said to her. He'd chosen to leave, and now he was learning to live with that choice, one step at a time, one day at a time, in the small town of Port Orchard, Washington, where the sea was colder and life was simpler. Evan chose Port Orchard almost by accident. After leaving San Diego, he drove north without a clear plan. He just wanted to be away from anything that reminded him of the past. Oregon was too full of memories, California was too close to the pain. Washington, with its rugged landscape, the gray waters of Puget Sound, and the small coastal towns, seemed like a good place to start over. Port Orchard was a quiet, almost sleepy town where people knew each other by name and life moved as slowly as the waters of the bay. There was no rush, no hustle, and Evan liked it that way. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. He rented a small house on the outskirts of town, overlooking the bay, and invested his savings in an old boat repair shop that a local fisherman was selling before retiring. It was a modest shop, a wooden shed with peeling paint, rusty tools, and the smell of tar permeating the place. But to Evan, it seemed ideal. He knew the sea, he knew the ships, he knew how to fix things that others had dismissed as hopeless. His hands, accustomed to the wheel of a destroyer, now held a hammer and a grinder, but there was something soothing, almost therapeutic, about it. Evan no longer wore a uniform. His wardrobe now consisted of flannel shirts, jeans, and old work boots. His face, weathered from years at sea, had softened slightly, though there was still a shadow of pain in his eyes. The locals accepted him quickly. He was not a man to talk much, but his ability to listen, his quiet confidence, and his willingness to help made him one of their own in the small community. Fishermen brought him their boats, yacht owners asked for advice, and children playing on the dock began to call him the sailor, though he never told them about his service. When they asked, he would just smile, tilt his head slightly, and say, "Just a man who loves the sea." Mornings in Port Orchard began with fog rising from the bay, blanketing everything in a soft gray blanket. Evan would wake up early, before dawn, brew coffee in an old seive, and step out onto the porch of his little house to watch the first rays of sunlight break through the clouds. He loved these moments of silence, when the world seemed pure, untouched by the hustle and bustle. Today was a typical day, and he headed to the workshop, putting on his tattered jacket and taking a thermos of coffee. The workshop was a stone's throw from the dock, and its doors were already open when he arrived. His assistant, a young fellow named Lucas, was already tinkering with the motor of an old cutter that a local fisherman named Jim had dragged in the day before. Lucas was a lanky guy with wild blonde hair and a habit of humming under his breath, even as he worked. He was the son of one of the locals, and Evan had hired him because the boy was smart and not afraid of dirty work. "Morning, boss," Lucas said, looking up from the engine. His hands were covered in oil and his face was grinning. Jim called again. "He says his boat has to be ready by Friday or he'll miss the salmon." Evan placed the thermos on the workbench and walked over to the boat, carefully examining the engine. He nodded, not taking his eyes off the rusty parts. "We'll manage," he said, his voice even but confident. "We need to change the fuel filter and check the carburetor. I think it's clogged." Lucas whistled, wiping his hands with a rag. "You're always so calm, Evan. I would have panicked by now. Jim said that if the boat didn't work, he would throw me overboard personally." Evan smiled, a rare thing for him, at the corner of his mouth. He picked up a wrench and began to disassemble the engine, his movements precise, almost mechanical. "Jim talks a lot," he replied, "but he won't throw you overboard. He loves his boat too much." Lucas laughed, and his laughter echoed around the shop. Evan liked working with him. The guy was easygoing, open, and his energy seemed to fill the void that still lived inside Evan. He didn't tell Lucas about his past, about the service, about Rachel, about why he was here. But Lucas didn't seem to need an explanation. He just accepted Evan for who he was. Around midday, Jim, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick beard and a voice that could be heard across the bay, walked into the shop carrying a paper bag of donuts he had bought at a local bakery. "Evan, Lucas, help me out," he thundered, setting the bag down on the workbench. "Without my boat, I'm helpless. The salmon don't wait, you know." Evan straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at Jim. His face was serious, but there was a flicker of genuine warmth in his eyes. "It'll be ready by Friday, Jim," he said. "But if you put any more cheap fuel in the tank, I'll throw you overboard myself." Jim laughed, slapping Evan on the shoulder so hard that he swayed slightly. "That's why I respect you, sailor. Straight as a storm in the open sea. Here are the donuts. You deserve them." Evan took one of the donuts, but didn't eat it, instead putting it on the table. He wasn't a big fan of sweets, but Jim's gesture touched him. People were like that in Port Orchard, simple, open, willing to share their last. It was so different from his old life, where everything was governed by strict rules and discipline. Here he could just be Evan, not a captain, not a hero, not a husband who had lost his wife. By evening the shop was empty. Lucas had gone home and Evan had stayed behind to finish the boat. He loved these quiet hours when he could be alone with himself and his thoughts. He turned on the old radio that stood in the corner, and a soft melody flowed from the speakers, something old rock that reminded him of his youth. He worked in silence, but his thoughts kept returning to the past. He didn't allow himself to think about Rachel too often, but sometimes she came into his memories like an uninvited guest. He saw her face, her eyes, her smile when she was happy. He remembered their honeymoon, their first years when they could talk for hours, laugh at silly things, plan for the future. But then he remembered her with Thomas, her laughter that was no longer his, and her silence that said more than words. He left her a letter, and it was his last word. He didn't know what she had done to him, didn't know if she cried, if she tried to find him. He forbade himself to think about it because he knew that if he started, he wouldn't be able to stop. Evan finished his work and walked out onto the dock to watch the sunset. The sun was setting below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and purple. He breathed in the salty air, feeling the coolness fill his lungs. Here by the water, he felt at home, even if it was a new, unfamiliar home. He wasn't sure he'd found peace, but he'd found something else, purpose. His workshop, his work, his connections to the people in this town made him feel like he was still needed, that his life had meaning. At that moment, Sarah, the owner of the local coffee shop, who sometimes brought him coffee and sandwiches, approached him. She was a woman in her 40s, with short red hair and a kind smile that seemed to be able to warm even the coldest day. "Evan, you've been sitting up too long again," she said, handing him a paper cup of coffee. "When are you going to learn to relax?" He took the coffee, nodded gratefully, and smiled slightly. "Rest is for those who don't know what to do," he replied, his voice soft but with a familiar restraint. Sarah laughed, leaning against the dock railing. "You're impossible, sailor. You know, people in town say you're like a lighthouse, always there, always reliable. But even lighthouses need repairs sometimes, you know." Evan looked at her, his eyebrows raising slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, but Sarah had a way of speaking that didn't seem pushy. "I'm fine, Sarah," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "Just doing what I can do." She nodded, but her eyes were attentive, as if she saw more than he wanted to show. "You're a good man, Evan, and this town loves you. But don't forget about yourself, okay? Life isn't all about boats and the sea." He didn't answer, but her words touched something inside him. He knew she was right, but he wasn't ready to think about himself, about what would happen next. He lived day by day, fixing boats, helping his neighbors, and listening to fishermen's stories. It was enough to keep him afloat. But deep down, he knew the void Rachel had left was still there. She was there, like a shadow, following him everywhere. After Sarah left, Evan stood on the dock, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky. He thought about how far he had come from his old life. He was no longer a captain, no longer a husband, no longer the man who could keep things under control. But here in Port Orchard, he was just Evan, the man who repaired boats, drank coffee with the neighbors, and smiled when the kids called him sailor. And maybe that was enough, at least for today. Port Angeles was a town where time moved slowly, like the Strait of Juan de Fuca lapping its shores. Everything was measured: the morning fog, the hammering of hammers on the dock, the chatter of fishermen at marges. Evan Stevens had grown accustomed to this rhythm in the 8 months since he moved from San Diego. His boat repair shop had become part of the life of the town, and he had become a man respected by the locals for his skillful hands and laconic wisdom. He didn't look for much. Silence, work, the sea that was enough to keep the past at bay. But the past, like the sea, had a habit of returning, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. One September day, with the air thick with the scent of wet pine and salt, a woman walked into Evan's workshop. She was young, about 30, with short dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and hazel eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and determination. She wore a light khaki jacket, jeans, and boots, as if she were preparing for a hike rather than a stroll through a small coastal town. She held a notepad and pen in her hands, and a bag slung over her shoulder with the corner of her laptop sticking out. Evan, standing at the workbench, sanding a piece of wood for a deck, looked up and froze. She didn't look like a local, and her appearance broke the usual silence of the workshop. "Evan Stevens?" she asked, her voice clear, with a slight rasp to it, as if she'd been talking too much or drinking coffee for too long. She smiled, and her smile was warm but not intrusive. Evan wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt and nodded. "It's me," he said, his voice even but slightly wary. "How can I help you?" She stepped forward, holding out her hand. "Laura Cassidy," she said. "I'm a journalist working on a series of articles about ex-servicemen starting new lives. Marge at the coffee shop said you might be someone worth talking to." Evan shook her hand, feeling the firmness of her grip. He glanced at her notepad, then back at her. He didn't like reporters too many questions, too little sincerity, but there was something about Laura that made him hold his gaze a little longer. Maybe it was her eyes, which looked straight ahead, without a hint of pretense. Maybe it was her smile, which seemed not forced but real. "Marge loves to talk," he said, smiling slightly. "But I'm not sure I have a story worth writing about." Laura laughed, and her laugh was light as the ringing of a bell. "She mentioned that too," she said, sitting down on an old wooden chair by the workbench without asking permission. She said you were more modest than a whale playing hide and seek, but I still want to try. May I? Evan shrugged, turning back to his work. He didn't like being interrupted, but something about her manner, casual, but not pushy, made him agree. Okay, he said, but I can't promise it will be interesting. And I'm working, so if you don't mind, I'll be fixing this deck. No problem, Laura said, opening her notebook and pulling out a pen. I can talk and listen at the same time. So, Evan, how did a former Navy captain end up in Port Angeles fixing boats? He glanced at her, his hands continuing to sand the board, but his movements became a little slower. It's not that difficult, he said. My service ended, and I wanted something simpler. I know the sea, I can repair boats. That's all. Laura narrowed her eyes, her pen hovering over her notebook. Easier, she asked. You were a destroyer captain, commanding hundreds of men, going on missions all over the world. And now you're here, in a town where half the people are fishermen and the other half are tourists. This isn't just a change of job, Evan. This is a change of life. Her words touched something inside him, but he didn't show it. He put the grinder down and looked at her, his eyes calm, but there was a shadow of something deep, almost painful, in them. Sometimes life decides what you need, he said. I didn't look for Port Angeles. It found me. Laura nodded, writing something down in her notebook. She didn't rush him, didn't ask any more questions, just waited, giving him space. It was unexpected. He was used to people either demanding answers or filling the silence with empty words. But Laura was silent, and her silence was comfortable, almost friendly. They talked for another hour. Evan talked about the sea, about learning to repair boats as a young man, about how Port Angeles had become his home. He avoided personal details, didn't mention Rachel, didn't talk about the pain that still lingered in his chest. But Laura seemed to sense where the lines were and didn't try to cross them. Instead, she talked about herself, about how she'd started writing about the military after her brother returned from Afghanistan and found it hard to find his place in civilian life. He was like a lost person, she said, her voice quieter. I could see him trying to pretend everything was okay, but inside, he was still out there in the desert. I started writing to understand people like him, and maybe to help them. Evan looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone was talking to him about something other than the article. He nodded, unsure of what to say, but her words stayed with him. Laura came into the shop a few more times over the next week. Sometimes she asked questions, sometimes she just sat and watched him work, telling him stories from her travels. Her presence was light, unobtrusive, and Evan began to find himself looking forward to her visits. She made him laugh, not loudly, not uncontrollably, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if awakening something he had long buried. One evening, as the rain pounded the roof of the studio, Laura came in with 2 cups of coffee from Marge's. She handed one to Evan, her fingers brushing lightly against his, and he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with coffee. Do you ever miss the sea? She asked, sitting down on the box and looking at him. Not the work, but the freedom, the way it makes everything easier. Evan sipped his coffee, lost in thought. He looked out the window at the dark waters, where the lights of the dock reflected in the waves. Sometimes, he admitted, the sea, it's honest, it doesn't pretend. If there's a storm, you know it's going to be hard. If you're calm, you know you can breathe. On land, it's more difficult. Laura nodded, her eyes shining in the lamplight. I understand, she said. When I write, sometimes I feel like I'm at sea. Sometimes the words flow like waves, and sometimes I drown. Evan smiled, and this time the smile was genuine. That's a good metaphor, he said. You must be a good writer. I try, she said, and her smile was warm, almost intimate. But you know, Evan, I don't just come here for the article. You're interesting. Not as a captain, not as a boat builder, as a person. He froze, his hand holding the cup halfway. Her words were simple, but they touched something inside him, something he had long locked away. He looked at her, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could open up, even just a little. "I'm not that interesting, Laura," he said, but his voice was softer than usual. "Just a man trying to get on with his life." "And that's history," she replied, leaning a little closer. "Living on is not as easy as it seems." They sat there for a long time, talking about small things: the sea, her articles, how Marge made the best fish soup in the world. Evan felt the tension he'd been carrying for months begin to dissolve. Laura wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't trying to dig into his past. She was just there, and that was enough. As she walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and her smile, Evan realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about Rachel. Not about her laughter, not about her betrayal, not about the letter he'd left. He was thinking about Laura, about her voice, about her eyes that saw him not as a captain, not as a boat builder, but as a person. And that warmth, that feeling that he could be alive again, was a new beginning for him. Port Angeles greeted September with a cold wind that carried the smell of salt and pine, mixing with the smoke from the chimneys of local houses. Autumn in Washington state was harsh, but beautiful. The sky was covered with heavy clouds every now and then, and the sea seemed to sing its eternal song, sometimes calm, sometimes furious. Evan Stevens got used to this rhythm, to this wild, untamed nature that reminded him of the sea, but at the same time allowed him to breathe more freely than in San Diego. His boat repair shop became part of the town landscape. Local fishermen trusted him with their boats, children dropped in to listen to stories, and adults respected him for his laconic honesty and ability to bring even the most hopeless boats back to life. It had been almost a year since he had left his old life behind, leaving behind his house, Rachel, and everything that connected him to the past. In that time, he had learned to live again, slowly but surely finding peace in his work, in conversations with his neighbors, in long evenings by the sea. But that peace was as fragile as thin ice, and sometimes, in his quietest moments, he felt the past knocking at his heart, reminding him of what he had lost. He didn't allow himself to think about Rachel too often, but her image, her green eyes, her laughter, her hands covered in paint still lived within him, like a shadow that could not be erased. But with the arrival of Laura Cassidy, a journalist who had burst into his life with a notebook and a warm smile, that shadow had begun to fade, giving way to something new, something he did not yet fully understand. Laura had been in Port Angeles for nearly 2 weeks, researching her article about ex-military men. She came into the shop almost every day, sometimes with questions, sometimes just with coffee and a desire to talk. Evan, who had once avoided any conversation about himself, began to get used to her presence. Her voice, her laugh, her way of listening without interrupting, made him feel alive, not a captain, not a boat builder, just a person. She didn't try to dig into his past, didn't ask questions about what he had left behind, but her gaze, attentive and warm, said that she saw more than he was saying, and that scared him as much as it drew him. The sky was clear the last time Laura came into the shop, with a few clouds drifting across the sound like white sails. She walked in with her usual easy smile, but there was something new in her eyes, a hint of sadness mixed with determination. She held not a notebook in her hand, but a folded journal that she explained was her last article, published in Seattle. Evan, standing at the workbench, polishing a wooden sailboat rudder, looked at her, his heart tightening slightly. He knew her time in Port Angeles was coming to an end, but he hadn't prepared himself for the strange feeling her departure would bring to him, a mixture of relief and loss. "This is for you," Laura said, handing him the magazine. "I finished the article. I think you should read it, but not now, when you're ready." Evan took the magazine, his fingers brushing her hand, and he felt the warmth running across his skin. He looked at the cover, plain, with a photograph of a sailor at the helm and the title, "After the Storm, Stories of Those Who Found a New Course." He didn't open the magazine, just set it on the workbench next to his tools and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice even but slightly hoarse. "Are you leaving?" Laura nodded, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment they just looked at each other, as if trying to remember this moment. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I have a couple more cities on the list, but I wanted to say goodbye. And ask you one last question, if that's okay with you." Evan smiled, though it was more habitual than genuine. He was used to her questions, to her curiosity that never seemed intrusive. "Go ahead," he said, putting down the sander and wiping his hands on a rag. "But I can't promise the answer will be long." Laura laughed, and her laughter was like the sound of the wind, soft and light. She sat down on the edge of the workbench, her boots tapping lightly on the wooden floor. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost cautious. "To the past, to what you left behind, to the people, to life, to who you were." Her question was a punch to the gut, not a sharp one, but a soft one, almost imperceptible. Evan froze, his hands still on the rag. He looked at her, then out at the sea outside the studio window. The waves lapped lazily at the dock, the only sound in the silence. He thought of Rachel, her face, her voice, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine when he left. He thought of San Diego, the house that had once been theirs, the years they had spent together, and the pain that had left behind. He thought of who he had been: a captain, a husband, a man who believed he could keep things under control. But he was different now, and this change, this new life he had built here in Port Angeles, was his salvation. "No," he said at last, his voice firm but gentle, as if he were speaking to himself as well as Laura. "I've been the anchor too long. Now I'm the sail." Laura looked at him, her eyes widening, and a glimmer of something in them, not surprise, but understanding. She nodded, a smile touching her lips, and there was something in that smile that made Evan feel a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Sail," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "It's beautiful, Evan, and you know, I think it suits you." He smiled, and this time it was genuine, almost boyish. He didn't know what to say, but her words, her look, her presence filled him with something he'd lost long ago: hope. Not that he'd go back to the past, but that the future might be more than just survival. They left the workshop and walked to the dock where the boats were moored, bobbing in the waves. The sun was setting, painting the sky crimson and gold, and Evan felt something inside him release. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that he could breathe more easily. Laura stopped at the edge of the dock, her hair blowing in the wind, and turned to face him. "You know," she said, her voice almost a whisper, drowned out by the lapping of the waves. "When I started writing these articles, I thought I was looking for stories. But maybe I was looking for people. People who remind me that life goes on, even after the worst storm." Evan looked at her, and in her eyes he saw his own journey reflected back to him, the journey of a man who had fallen but risen, who had lost but found. He didn't know what to say, but words weren't necessary. He simply nodded, and that was enough. "Thank you, Laura," he said finally, "for everything." She smiled, her eyes shining in the sunset light. "Thank you, Evan, for letting me see the sail." She turned and walked toward her car, parked outside the shop. Evan watched her go, feeling the slight emptiness that her departure left in him, but not pain. It was a different kind of emptiness, the kind that preceded something new. He knew he might never see her again, but her words, her presence, would remain with him, a beacon guiding him. Evan walked back into the shop, picked up the magazine she had left behind, and opened it. The article about him was short, but Laura was in every word her attentiveness, her eye for the essence. She was not writing about a captain, not about a boat builder, but about a man who had found a new course. And in it, he saw himself not who he had been, but who he was becoming. Night fell on Port Angeles, and Evan walked out to the sea, standing at the water's edge. The waves sang their eternal song, and he listened to them, feeling the past finally letting go of him. He was no longer an anchor, holding everything in place. He was a sail, ready to catch the wind, ready to go wherever the sea called. And in this was his freedom, his hope, his new life. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.